This is a 98 Chevy Blazer, 4.3 in it, full drive. It's doing ABS stops where you stand on the brake and you're not slowing down, and here's this motor running out front, or feels like in the floor. As soon as you slow down to about 15 miles an hour, it kicks the ABS motor on. It thinks this wheel is skidding on the driver's side. On the scan tool, it gets down to 15 and then drops out till it gets down to 5, then comes back. And then the computer in this thing thinks it's got control of the wheel again when it doesn't. I've used a scan tool on it, and this wheel bearing speed sensor is dropping out on the driver's side. Sometimes you can unplug the connector to the ABS. It's up in the inner wheel well, and check the resistance of the speed sensor and determine which one's causing the problem, but other times you just need a scan tool to do it. I've raised the driver's side front end up, set it on a jack stand about in the middle of the back of the control arm. I'm going to take the 19mm lug nuts off, pull the wheel off of it. This is a new wheel bearing assembly. It's a whole hub assembly. I recommend just changing the whole assembly. Sometimes you can get away with scraping the crud out from underneath that, but if the air gap isn't right on those teeth, it'll cause it to drop out. This is a plug-in for the speed sensor. I'm electrically testing the new sensor. It's around 1,000 ohms. A little cooler than room temperature. Got the wheel off of it. This axle nut is 1 3/8 inches. And this ABS wire bracket is 10mm. And the caliper anchor plate hanger 18mm, and the caliper is 18mm with dual piston caliper. This has a dual piston caliper on it. Looks like somebody's changed all this stuff within a reasonable amount of time. But that's a no-no. ABS wire hanging down on the steering linkage. That bar goes back and forth as you turn the steering wheel and catches that wire underneath one of these one of these tie rod clamps, and it'll rip it out of there. There's the connector for the ABS sensor. I'm going to measure resistance on this wheel bearing. I'm sure it's an air gap thing because the sensor isn't going open. It just drops out, or the sensor can't pick up the teeth inside the wheel bearing going past it at a certain speed. And that's typically rust gets underneath the sensor and raises it up a little tiny bit, and that's enough to interfere with it picking the teeth up, because the sensor is like a magnetic deal, and the teeth going past causes a pulse in the signal to it. And if the gap's too big, it can't detect the pulse or read it right, or it's inconceivable for the computer to discern it from anything else. I stuck an ohmmeter leads into the connector, and the resistance is a little over 1,100 ohms. That's about 80 more ohms than the replacement one. I don't know if it's trivial or not. That's not too significant. I'm gonna do a little exploratory. I'm gonna go ahead and stick a punch in this rotor socket on this axle nut and take the axle nut loose before I take the caliper and hanger off. Well, the axle nut was not tightened down all the way, or it'd come loose or something. That would probably do it. It's probably damaged the bearing internally and causing it to make an air gap on the sensor by it moving around some. I'm going to go ahead and get on into it, see what's going on, get a little better look at it, get this stuff off of it. Turn your steering wheel to the right if you haven't done so already for on the driver's side, so you can get a good shot at these anchor plate bolts in the back. And get something to tie the caliper up so it's not hanging off this brake hose. It's relatively delicate for this big heavy caliper falling and hanging by it. Of course, it should have had a new hose put on it anyway. It's just old. It'll cause problems eventually. I just took the big anchor plate bolts loose. Took a screwdriver and kind of pried against the rotor. You might leave a lug nut on this to hold that rotor down while you're picking that off. It was a little cumbersome. I don't see any rust or problems with this. It's not loose. It must have been some kind of cheap aftermarket waste of money, I guess. Yeah, maybe there's a warranty on it, I don't know. But I say the nut was loose. It may have damaged it inside. The sensor's not loose and it's not open. Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and swap it out for a known good one, a new one. And take these 3 18mm loose in the back and unhook this 10mm holding clamp, and then the other fasteners along the way. Unplug it. I've got the caliper propped up there and it's stable, and the line's not crimped too much. It's not in a bind, it's not got a heavy load on it. Hard to do when it's fastened the way that it is, as big as that caliper is. I got the two out of the back while the steering wheel was turned to the right. I turn it back to the left and take the other bolt out through the front. I noticed these bolts have been lubricated, and they don't get lubrication, they get Loctite. They want your wheel bearing to come off. So I got to degrease them. And pay attention to your back brake dust cover. Its orientation. The ABS sensor goes to the center of it, facing front. That's nice. Grungy. I'm going to clean this hole out. Make sure the surface is rust and gristle free and flat, especially around the ears where the bolts go. Take any moisture or whatever off this and put a thin coat of grease on the splines. Degrease these threads in the nut if you're reusing it. Make sure this stud is bottomed out or it'll get caught under this upper control arm as you turn the steering wheel. Check your tie rod ends. Looks like a sway bar links auto effy. Make sure your dust cover is relatively rust free and the mounting surfaces are wheel free. I degrease the wheel bearing bolts for the most part. I'm going to spray them again. You can still see some of the original factory Loctite on it. These splines can be greased, but not the threads. I recommend using a new lock nut on this. The axle shaft splines have a thin coat of grease on them. There's no gristle on this flat surface where the bearing smashes against. The threads are dry. The wheel bearing retaining bolts have a coat of blue Loctite on the first 3/4 inch of them. And the back dust covers drop down in line with the ABS sensor wire. And got little raised up tabs to keep it centered on the triangle shape. Now I just need to slip this bearing over top of the axle shaft with this ABS sensor wire facing forward over top of the tie rod end, because this will go into the stud right there on that bracket. And start slipping the bolts in once I get this top hole in line with this and the other two in line. You could straighten the wheel up to help guide the axle shaft through the center of the wheel bearing. Just be sure your caliper is secured and doesn't fall off or anything. I was going to mention sometimes these axles have a sweet spot to line them splines up to get them coming through there relatively easy, and you may have to rotate the axle shaft sometimes to get it to the splines as far as possible till you find the right spot. And then if it's still not going through, get one bolt started and just kind of get it pulled down some. There's still a gap in it, and I'll put the axle nut on there temporarily and pull the axle on through it most of the way to help that along. But if it gets too hard or something, you don't want to keep pouring it on, or you'll not get the axle back out of it, not without a bunch of problems. But it shouldn't just a little skippy. I don't know if it's variations in the manufacturing process or whether somebody's been here before and damaged the splines, who knows. But all of those reasons. This will help out by helping pulling the axle through. You don't want to force it against the guts inside the axle or the rear end. That worked well. I just put some spacers under it so I didn't run the nut all the way back there, and pulled the axle through it. The wheel bearing hold down bolts, all three of them, tightened to 78 foot-pounds, thereabout. They're Loctited in there, so they should stay for a while. They're not permanently Loctited, just blue Loctite, but even the red wouldn't permanently lock them. Not the small stuff. It would great big stuff, it might. I'm going to go ahead and tighten those down. This axle nut, preferably a new one. If not, blue Loctite the last inch or inch and a quarter or so and tighten it down to 103 foot-pounds. These anchor plate bolts tighten down to 133 foot-pounds, 35, 135. And if you took the caliper loose, these pins tighten down to 85 foot-pounds. Route your ABS sensor where it needs to be. It has a guide tab there, and keep it upright. Be sure and fasten it along with the brake line to keep it out of the tie rod end coupling. Clear up, then clip it onto that connector up out of the dirt and water and stuff up under this tar paper stuff. Make sure your back brake plate's pretty good and not jammed up somewhere. It's just nice flat all the way around. I've snugged the bolts down and I'm going to torque them down to 78-9 foot-pounds. Be sure not to use an impact to put your nut on. The hammering action can damage the balls inside the wheel bearing and make it fail real early. And take it apart with one if you're putting a new wheel bearing in it. Just don't put it together with one. Okay, that's done. Just turn your steering wheel back and forth to get to them suckers. 80, 79, 80, 78. Just make sure your caliper doesn't fall off. And when you're routing it, if you're using zip ties, just leave them a little loose. The suspension goes up and down and it kind of needs to slip and slide a little bit. Be sure and clean the back side of your rotor out. And if it has any marks for like these holes, line them back up. Get any debris out of there. That'll cause it to be popped up and make the brake pedal pulsate. Hit it with some brake cleaner maybe. I'm going to stick it on there and put a spacer under it and a lug nut to hold it square on this while I put the caliper back down on it. As far as the caliper hanger bolts go, you can or you don't have to Loctite them. I think originally I had Loctite on them, but at 35 foot-pounds, I've never seen them come loose unless they didn't get put that tight in the first place. Got a lot of it back together. The axle nut tightens down to 103 foot-pounds as recommended by the manufacturer of the wheel bearing. So 103, 105. With some blue Loctite. I used a better design nut on it. It really probably didn't even need Loctite, but there was a white going down on it where it's tapered on the head of it to bite on. Always back your torque wrench off when you're done using it so you don't damage the calibration as bad. Thought one of the original hanger locations for the ABS wire, somebody just cut it off there. I'm going to take a 1/2 inch or 13 millimeter, either one, This is actually a 1/2 inch, and pick that out of there and put it back on this wire to keep it up off of the tie rod linkage. Make sure your brake hose isn't twisted up or got a problem. And all your bolts on your caliper and anchor plate are tight. The dust shield's not bent into the rotor. 10mm tightened down on this bracket. And it looks good enough to me. It's still slack in all aspects of the sensor wire. And it's not going to get into the tie rod end. Still let the suspension work up and down without jerking the wire. And put the wheel back on this thing. The lug nuts tightened down to 95 foot-pounds, or probably 100. Many times this wheel's been on and off over the years. Let's look everything over and make sure it's tight and not scraping somewhere. And there's nothing getting caught up in the workings. You can even put a little trail of grease right here in the center hub to keep the wheels from sticking to it if you have that trouble. Pump your brakes up, make sure you got a good pedal before you start it up, put it in gear. Cleaned up the mess. I might have a look around, make sure nothing's going to get in trouble in here. Should be good to go.